Hi, girls. This is the last cardiovascular screencast. It's on cardiac cycle and cardiac conduction. And so before we look at this, actually, I want to point out about the videos. This video is an excellent summary. I linked it on Jupiter Ed. This video is the one we watched in class. It's really helpful for the cardiac cycle, for all aspects of the cardiac cycle. But feel free to watch any of them if you'd like to have more. Okay, so here we're looking at the heart muscles and noticing the difference between the diagram on the left and the diagram on the right. And I think it's pretty clear. If you look at the ventricles on the left, they are contracting and therefore ejecting the blood out of the ventricles. Okay, I know I seem crazy, but I don't see my mouse well during screencast. That's why I keep shaking it up. Okay, so in the ventricles here, the blood is being ejected out the pulmonary artery. In this ventricle here, the muscle's squeezing tight to eject blood out through the aorta. All right, instead here, the ventricle is relaxed. And so, first, a quick vocabulary thing. When we talk about the heart, systole is the word for contraction. Diastole is the word for relaxation. Ventricular systole means the contracting of the ventricles. Ventricular diastole means the relaxation of the ventricles. And then atrial systole, contraction of the atria, and relaxation of the atria. Notice that if you just hear the word systole alone, it's referring to ventricular systole because the really important contraction is of the ventricles. The atria are quite minor. Okay, so can you name these? I think you probably can. This one is systole, to be precise, ventricular systole. This one is diastole, to be precise, ventricular diastole. Okay, here the ventricles are contracting and blood is being ejected. Here the ventricles are relaxing and blood is filling the heart. Note that we've always been talking about the left and the right at different moments because we're focusing on the pathway of blood, through which blood vessels the blood entered the heart and exited the heart and so on. Now we're going to be talking about the heart with both sides, recognizing that both sides are doing the same activity simultaneously. So both ventricles are contracting simultaneously, and blood is being ejected from both sides simultaneously, even though from two different blood vessels. Okay. All right. There's one more aspect we need to look at here. Okay, there's my mouse. So here we have, can you guess what it is? It's relaxation of both ventricles and atria, and blood is filling the heart. Here, if you look at the ventricles, you can see what we saw earlier is ventricular systole, ventricular contraction. And look what's happening to the blood. It's exiting the heart through the atria, through the arteries, okay? You can disregard this. This is pointing out that the blood starts filling the atria again, but this is not important about this moment of the heartbeat. This moment of the heartbeat, what's really important is the ventricles contracting and the blood exiting the heart. But there's something in between, which we didn't talk about. Can you see what's happening here? Look at the atria here as compared to there. Here, the atria are contracting. So this is atrial systole. It's a much smaller systole. It's also much briefer. Basically, the atria contract so that they send all the blood out of the atria down into the ventricles. It's just an emptying of the atria. Okay? So this is a little summary of everything that's happening, what we just explained. So take a look at that. Make sure you understand it. And go back to this and be able to label all that on your own, to understand all that on your own, okay? Notice one last thing. Atrial systole is often also still called diastole because it's ventricular diastole. It's within diastole, there's this moment called atrial systole. Okay. So I'm going to focus on this one again. I think the green one is a little bit more confusing. Can you go through this whole cycle and start here and understand what's going on? Looking at just the heart muscles. So this whole part here is relaxation. In other words, diastole. This whole half from 6 o'clock to 12 o'clock is diastole. And what's happening to the heart? It's relaxed and blood is filling it. Then right here begins atrial contraction. Okay, the ventricles are still relaxed, but it's atrial contraction. So the atria contract and empty all their blood into the ventricles. And then the last moment here is when the ventricles contract and blood shoots out of the heart through the arteries. okay? And this represents the timing. If this whole circle, this whole cycle is one heartbeat, half of it is relaxation diastole. 0.1 second is, I lost my, okay. This brief little moment here is atrial contraction. And then a slightly longer moment, but still less than half, is ventricular contraction. All right, so we looked at all the heart muscles during this heartbeat cycle. The next thing we're going to look at is what are the valves doing during this heartbeat cycle. So let me remind you the names of the valves. The valve between atria and ventricles, so there's one set of valves here, one set of valves there, are called AV valves. The valves between ventricles and the artery, the exit artery, whether it be the pulmonary or the aorta, are called SL valves, semilunar valves. So this one and this one is a bit hard to see because it's behind. Here they are again, the SL valve and the SL valve right there. Okay, so let's look at what's happening. Here, heart is filling and the AV valves are, look at them, open. They must be open for the heart to fill. Here, the atria are contracting. The AV valves are open. They must be open in order to fill the ventricles still. But at the very end of this, as soon as the atria are done contracting, guess what happens? The AV valves snap shut. And the first sound of the heartbeat occurs right here. It's called S1, sound 1. It's also called lub. The heartbeat is characterized as lub-dub, lub-dub. So sound 1 is called lub. And it's the sound of the valves closing. And that occurs right here as the atria finish contracting, all the blood pours in, these valves shut because they're done. Right now the connection between atria and ventricles is done. Both these valves shut, and right here at this moment is S1, sound 1. Now begins ventricular systole. So this is the huge muscular effort of the heart. The ventricles contract, and as they contract, they shoot blood out of the arteries. They're sending blood to the lungs, and they're sending blood to the whole body. So can you guess what's happening with the valves at this moment? The AV valves must be shut. Of course they're shut. Otherwise, blood would be pouring back up. As the ventricles contract, it would be shoving blood back up into the atria. That would be a disaster. So the AV valves are both shut. Which valves are open? Well, now since blood is exiting into the arteries, the arterial valves are open, the SL valves. The SL stands for semilunar. Remember, they have that half moon shape, so they're called semilunar. So the two SL valves are open at that moment. Okay, and then at the end, I lost it again. At the end of this ventricular systole, right here, can you guess what happens? The SL valves shut suddenly, and that is S2, the second sound of the heartbeat, the dub in lub-dub, lub-dub, is right there. It's the SL valves shutting. This also shows you why it's the timing isn't even, but in the heartbeat it's not lub-dub, lub-dub, it's lub-dub, lub-dub, because right here is the lub, the AV valves closing, and right here is the dub, the SL valves closing, and then you're more than half the cycle to go before you get the next sound. And that's why there's kind of an asymmetry, if you will. Okay, this is also a useful diagram. Notice that the bright light green is ventricular diastole. This whole thing is ventricular diastole. Can you see the ventricles relaxed? Here is ventricular systole. You can see the ventricles contracting, shooting blood out. And notice they also have a smaller diagram for atrial systole and atrial diastole. So if you want to look at this diagram, I think is helpful too. You can pause it and look at that. Okay, take a look at this, and there's lots of labels in black. So what I suggested is that we make our own labels in red and blue. Can you do that? Try to do it on your own. And here are the answers. I think it makes sense. I'm not going to re-explain it because I think if you go through it, you're going to understand what's going on. This is the timing without looking at the pictures. This is the timing. So we're starting down here, remember. So 0.4 seconds, 0.1 second, 0.3 seconds is obviously based on a 0.8 second heartbeat, which is roughly average. Okay, so this is the cardiac conduction system. It's the electrical system of the heart that we're looking at. It's less difficult than what we just did, so don't worry. Basically, these green lines are like the circuit. They're like the electrical pathway of the heart. The heart has these really specialized fibers or cells that most heart cells contract. They're muscles. But some heart cells aren't specialized for contracting, they're specialized for conducting an impulse, just like a wire is specialized for conducting electricity. It's not exactly electricity that's being conducted, although it's similar. It's electrical impulses, right? We know that's true of all nerves in our body. It's also true of these special cells within the heart. The green cells are the pathway of the circuit. They show the pathway. This is the SA node. This is the AV node. The label is gone, but it's called AV node. It stands for atrioventricular. Sinoatrial node and atrioventricular node. Those are the only two you need to label. Then you just need to understand the direction. The direction is basically this kicks it off, sends the electrical stimulation to all the atria, and there's this little delay built in while the atria contract, and then the electrical stimulation goes here and gets sent down to the ventricles in this way, in a sort of a anchor shape. It goes down the center and then up the two sides, simultaneously up the two sides like an anchor. And that stimulates the ventricles to contract. So here's a lot of background information. Doggone it, it's cut off here. I guess you'll be able to read it this way. I think if you read this, this gives you background information about cardiac conduction. You can pause it and read it. Okay, this is a good summary. So cardiac conduction, this is showing us the heart's electrical pathway. This time it's red, not in green. We begin at the SA node. It initiates the impulse. Notice the SA node is actually called the pacemaker. It sets the pace of the heartbeat because it's where the heartbeat starts every time. Then from the SA node, it travels along specialized conductive cells, the wires of the heart, if you will, and it travels to both the atria, and the result is the atria contract because the electrical impulse stimulates the atria and it stimulates contraction. The atria contract. Then the impulse has now arrived at the AV node, where it's going to spread to the ventricles by going down the center part, it's called the septum, and then curling back up the two sides. And in that way, it's stimulating the ventricles. And what's the result? The ventricles contract. So this is kind of like the flow chart that explains the whole cardiac conduction and the result. I think that's it. The last thing we need to look at is the EKG or ECG. EKG and ECG are the same thing. It's electrocardiogram is what they stand for. In one case, there's a K for cardio. In one case, there's a C for cardio. So what's happening here is that there's three curves. The electrocardiogram measures the electrical activity of the heart muscle. And it's very light electrical activity, but if it's measured, it gives you this kind of a graph, which is really helpful for doctors trying to see what's going on with someone's heart. So there's the P curve, there's the QRS curve, and there's the T curve. Don't worry about the U, we're not going to talk about it. The P curve is really simple. It's called atrial depolarization. You could just about substitute the word depolarization for stimulation, as in electric stimulation. Atrial stimulation. The atria are being stimulated. Very soon after this curve starts going up, guess what starts to happen? The atria, the atria contract. Okay, so atrial contraction is happening right in this area. Then there's a pause, and there is this really sharp and sudden spike, which is the depolarization or the stimulation of the ventricles. You can imagine why it's lots higher, because the ventricles are bigger, and they're going to contract much more strong and with much greater strength. And so it's this big, tall, intense spike. And that's ventricular depolarization. Depolarization, you can substitute it with stimulation. It's just a fancy word for the type of electric stimulation. Get rid of that. Okay. The type of electric stimulation that is causing the heart muscle to contract. So here's the ventricular depolarization, and very soon after the beginning of the QRS curve spiking, the ventricle actually starts to contract. So the contracting is just a slight delay off this electrical activity. Then the next thing that happens is what's called repolarization, which you can think of it as recharging. You're not going to really understand what this means until we study muscle cells, but a muscle cell is kind of like a battery, and every time it contracts, it's using all of its energy, and then it needs to be recharged. Otherwise, it won't be able to contract again. And so the heart, every heartbeat cycle, every time your heart beats, the ventricles need to repolarize. The atria do too. And so the repolarization is this T curve. It's the